Hi, folks. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome Pages, a series of book discussions hosted by ASWAD, the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. My name is James Cantres. Today, we are excited to host Professor Olufemi Taiwo for a discussion of his recent book, Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. I'm going to introduce our discussant, Professor Yuko Miki, and she will introduce Professor Taiwo. But first, a few announcements. ASWAD's 11th Biennial Conference and convening of the International Congress of African and African Diaspora Studies, ICAADS, will be hosted at the University of Ghana, Legon, from the 2nd to the 5th of August in 2023. The theme is Repatriating African Studies. The deadline for submissions has just passed. For more information on that conference, please visit our website at aswaddiaspora.org. ASWAD's programming is made possible through the support of our members. If you are already a member, we thank you. If you have yet to join, we encourage you to sign up at aswaddiaspora.org. You can also donate at our website to support other initiatives, including our efforts to provide free membership to Global South members, as well as conference travel grants for Global South members attending our convenings. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Miki. Miki uses she/her pronouns, is Associate Professor of History and the Associate Director of Latin American and Latinx Studies at Fordham University in New York. She is the author of Frontiers of Citizenship, a Black and Indigenous History of Post-Colonial Brazil, which was out from Cambridge University Press in 2018, followed by its paperback debut the following year. That book won the Wesley Logan Prize for Best Book in African Diaspora History from the American Historical Association, as well as the Warren Dean Prize for the Best Brazilian from the Conference on Latin American History, among others. The Portuguese edition of the book is under contract with Brazil's Companhia das Letras. She's currently working on a narrative history of the illegal slave trade to Brazil in the mid-19th century for the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and Yale University's Gilder Lehrman Center, among others. A native of Tokyo, Miki resides in Brooklyn. Professor Miki, thank you for being our discussant today. Over to you.
Hey, thank you, James, for the introduction. I hope my connection is okay. Please signal at any point if you can't hear me. And I also wanted to thank Lori Lambert for the invitation. And just before diving in, I wanted to first of all apologize for my voice. I completely lost my voice about 2 weeks ago, and it's still not back. So I'm a little hoarse, and I hope I won't cough, but please bear with me if that's the case. So my guest, Femi Taiwo, is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University. Taiwo received his PhD in philosophy at UCLA. He's published in academic journals ranging from Public Affairs Quarterly, One Earth, Philosophical Papers, and the American Philosophical Association newsletter, Philosophy and the Black Experience. Taiwo's theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. His public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, have been featured in The New Yorker, The Nation, Boston Review, Dissent, The Appeal, Slate, Al Jazeera, The New Republic, Eon, and Foreign Policy. He's the author of Reconsidering Reparations, and most recently, Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else, published by Haymarket Press in fall of 2022. I'm delighted that we'll be talking about this book in depth today, and I have my own copy here, courtesy of his very kind agent whom I met. I had the pleasure of meeting Femi in the fall when he was in an event with Robin Kelly celebrating Freedom Dreams at the Schomburg Center, and I'm glad that this event has allowed our paths to cross again today. Femi Taiwo, welcome to ASWAD's From the Pages, and congratulations on your book, Elite Capture.
Thanks a lot for having me, and thanks everybody for putting this together.
So I thought we could start by just having you simply explain to us what elite capture is. It appears that it's a concept that's been around in certain circles, but I certainly was new to it. And so I thought maybe you could start us out there and then your take on it.
Yeah, so the basic idea of the elite capture is it's what happens when the most advantaged people in a group get sort of disproportionate control over typically resources. Often the economists or social scientists who are studying this were studying how few well-positioned people ended up with all of the aid dollars that went for development projects, that kind of thing. But it could also be applied flexibly to getting to set the political direction of a movement. So, for example, if you were thinking about the LGBTQ set of political issues, one allegation that some activists have made has been that there's been over-focus on marriage equality as a political issue because that was an issue that was desired by people who are comparatively advantaged in the movement, white gay men, for example, but it wasn't adequately reflective of the entire group of people's interests. So elite capture can mean when the advantaged people get control of resources or the political movement of institutions or social movements.
Great, thank you so much. And I have to say that once you started describing it, to quote the recent movie, I just felt like elite capture was everything everywhere all at once. But I was wondering, for your work in particular, what drove you to address elite capture from your perspective in your work? And what point of view are you bringing in this book that you feel is that we need to learn about?
Yeah, I mean, I think your reaction just now helps explain it really well, right? So I was seeing a lot of criticisms of identity politics that I thought were onto something, but a lot of the things that people were saying about identity politics, that it was inattentive to class issues, or that identity politics-based ways of framing political struggle were, overly responsive to the kinds of concerns of, the kinds of people of color that make it into elite institutions, for instance, right? It seemed to me like a lot of those criticisms were pointing at something that identity politics has in common with everything else, right? And so part of why I was trying to talk about elite capture was trying to, on the one hand, take seriously some of the criticisms of identity politics, but also to take seriously, the extent to which those kinds of political problems are just baked into the nature of politics and the nature of power. And so, can we think about those problems of elite capture in ways that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to identity politics?
Right. And what was so striking about reading your book was that, of course, when we hear identity politics, as we all know today, as you kind of alluded to right now, too, it's used, as it's considered to be very divisive, right? That maybe the kind of the common way to think of identity politics now is that people kind of cleaving to their own affiliations, whether it be race or class or gender, ethnicity, religion, etc., and that it becomes a way for people to kind of, promote their own interests and to kind of silo themselves up, to not kind of engage in a broader discussion about like maybe a broader transformative vision. And yet, so I was really startled to mention for your discussion of the little known and surprising origin of the idea of identity politics. So I was wondering maybe if you could you could guide us through that discussion and to kind of see what's happened to the idea of identity politics since then.
Yeah, I think it's really instructive to think about the origins of the concept, not because concepts can't change or evolve, or, we have to have the same ideas that the first people had. But I think the people that came up with the concept of identity politics were actually already responding to a lot of the problems that are now associated with identity politics. So the term identity politics comes from a manifesto written by a queer Black feminist socialist collective called the Combahee River Collective that formed in Boston in the 70s. And the founders of this collective put out a statement when where they were writing alongside other socialist feminists. It came out in a socialist feminist anthology. And they were writing about why they felt the need to pursue what they called identity politics, which was rooting their politics and their political priorities in an analysis of their own situation, right? So they found that Black women's issues were marginalized in the feminist movement, that women's issues were marginalized in the movements for racial justice, that within the Black feminist movements, queer politics and socialist politics weren't as prominent as they would have liked. And so from all these different directions, they found that they were getting sidelined politically. And they said, look, we have the right to look at our own political situation and start from there and figure out what we think is important. They weren't saying that they weren't going to go on from that analysis of their particular situation as queer Black women and work in solidarity with other people. They were in fact saying the opposite of that. So one of the explicit positions that was prominent in the women's liberation movement in the United States at that time was a position called feminist separatism or lesbian separatism. And that was a position that women should physically and politically distance themselves from men, like literally, they should separate and start their own kinds of societies and political programs and so on and so forth. And the Combahee River Collective was positioning themselves against that very explicitly. They said, look, we need to understand our situation, but we have solidarity with and fight with Black men against racism, even as we struggle with them over sexism. So the point of the analysis was to understand how they wanted to move in the world, but it wasn't that they were going to only move with other people like them and only struggle with other people like them. And that's the kind of ethos that identity politics has come to be associated with over the years, even though it started from the exact opposite place.
Right. So that was so striking to me. Think that, oh, it's like the Combahee River Collective was, right, as you just stated so clearly, was about kind of thinking about their own situation, but as a way to find a mode of connection, right? And so what do you think happened? I mean, as you just said earlier, of course, ideas aren't static. They do change in meaning sometimes over time, but it seems like the way that we think about identity politics now is just so different. And so how do you see this transformation in the way that since the Combahee River Collective that identity politics has come to mean?
So I think one of the big stories is a kind of large-scale ideological transformation that's happened in global politics since the 60s and 70s, which was the time in which the Combahee River Collective was writing. Not too long ago, and certainly not long before the Combahee River Collective was writing their statement, explicit apartheid, explicit commitment to social hierarchy was actually the global rule of the day. It was taken to be compatible with, whatever democracy and freedom are supposed to mean, that there were explicit formal colonial domination of many countries by few countries. The British Empire alone controlled a quarter of the world's population and landmass before the Second World War. And it was in the 60s and 70s, in the era of the Cold War and in the era of the global anti-colonial movements, that a lot of this was being renegotiated. The number of member states in the United Nations went from less than 40 to something closer to 200. So it was a massive decolonization movement in Asia and Africa. And what came with that material change to how many countries there were and how political justification was being understood was the ruling class could no longer sell explicit, racial ideologies in the way that they had for the past 300 years before that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this new environment, with, a new need for kind of colorblind, identity blind ideologies, I think there was an attempt to absorb a lot of the politics that was associated with civil rights, with social progress, with resistance to apartheid, so on and so forth. And I think we are largely, historically and ideologically speaking, experiencing a set of reactions to this new normal.
Mm.
And what identity politics means for some people in that context is an attempt to resist some of the sort of artificial homogenization of politics that has happened after that.
Mm.
And I think that is part of the story of what motivates people who use identity politics in more, I guess you could call them sectarian, more skeptical of coalitional kinds of ways,
Mm-hmm.
right? The idea of all of us being the same or in it together has come to be associated with this sort of new political center. And there's a kind of reaction to it that people are using identity politics to explain.
Interesting to think about the reaction to sameness. As a Latin American, I'm always talking about how difference is constructed, even in this apparent discourse of sameness, or that people are unmarked. And it's just kind of interesting to hear the parallels. And thank you for bringing in, your background also in studying African anti-colonial politics. And I was going to ask you a little bit later about, because you have such an engagement, especially with Portuguese Africa. So I was going to ask you a little bit more about it in a little bit. But, just for the purposes of this conversation, you just gave us kind of this grand kind of historical context for it. But also I was wondering maybe if we could talk about this happening in the much more immediate past. And we were talking about how the identity politics idea, I don't know whether the expression is being co-opted or it's been hijacked, I think was one of the words you used. But in the more recent past, you gave the example of what happened in DC with the mayor of Muriel Bowser, the Black mayor of DC. And I was wondering if you could share that story with us for a few moments right now to really give us a concrete sense of how these discourses or these political ideas become, I guess, elite captured. I don't know if I could say that in the passive voice, but that it happens.
Yeah. So just to remind everybody, I'm sure most people know the basics, but in the summer of 2020, there was a global uprising. There was a uprising in the United States in particular in response to police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade, all names that people know now partly because of these protests. There's a huge summer of protests. I was in DC at the time, and going out on the streets, and the police were fighting us and gassing us and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm walking down these same streets months later, and painted on the street near the White House is Black Lives Matter. And it was, as I understand it, was something of a taunt from the mayor of DC, who is Black, to then President Donald Trump. And I thought about that for a while, and there's a lot to be said about it. But I think the most direct thing to say about elite capture is the way that the kind of symbolism of identity politics and solidarity with a marginalized identity, in this case, Black people in the United States, was put to the service of the political career of this particular, the mayor of DC, right, who is a strong Black political figure, who is the mayor of a major US city and presumably has a promising career going forward. The use of that kind of iconography, of that kind of symbolism in service of their political aspirations while they were increasing the budget for MPD, which is the police department that a lot of the people in the street were protesting against, along with the other police departments, really is a kind of visceral example of the more general thing that I think has been happening, which is people of the professional class, people in lucrative positions in business or in entertainment or in politics, being able to speak the language of identity politics, but in service of goals which bear a tenuous relationship, if any, with the Black struggle for liberation more generally.
And I was going to ask you about that because obviously you are very much rooted as a philosopher in the Black radical tradition, and to see these examples of, the mayor of DC or some other Black leaders who have used the discourse of Black Lives Matter in order to kind of, to further organs of state violence, for instance, like increasing the police force, et cetera. Like, I'm wondering how you read that. Do you race-based movements, race-based solidarity movements? There's such a tension, right? Because it's not Amazon, as somebody was saying the other day, like, I was on Amazon and Amazon was telling me that Black Lives Matter, like that, the ridiculousness is obvious. But when Black elite figures like the mayor of DC, when they start to use this kind of discourse, but to further a politics that is clearly not coalitional, like how are we supposed to respond to that? How are you, as someone who's also rooted in the Black radical tradition, how are we supposed to read that kind of politics or elite capture?
Yeah, I think that's among the central political questions of this age, right? It's always been true. It's a tried and true feature of colonialism that, you elevate a fraction of the colonized people, of the oppressed people, to help you control the larger portion of them. This is not something that's new even in the last 500 years. But what is new is the size and strength of those privileged classes, particularly in Black politics, right? Before the 60s and 70s, like we were talking about earlier, the sort of indigenous elites or the colonized elites were not heads of state, right? They were formally part of the British Empire or informally networked with the French Empire, or whatever the political relationship was, right? Until a few decades ago, there couldn't have been a Black mayor of DC. That is fairly historically recent. Mm-hmm. And I think, one set of questions we should be asking in this era is what the politics looks like of trying to fight against identity-based injustices in a ruling class that is increasingly multicultural, right? Mm-hmm. A ruling class in both the business sense, if we're talking about wealthy people are still disproportionately white. They're not exclusively white. Mm-hmm. Wealthy elites, military elites are still disproportionately men, but not exclusively, etc. Now Gina Haspel can, run the CIA, right? And Janet Napolitano can run national security. So what does it look like to fight against identity-based injustice in an era where the degree to which people from your identity group are part of the power structure is greater than in previous eras? Mm-hmm. I hope that by posing it as a difference of degree rather than of kind, but maybe it suggests that at least some of the stuff people have tried in the past might still be the kind of stuff that would work today. And that's why I've been talking about coalitional politics, or constructive politics, the kinds of organizations that can build durable power, and putting those at the center of political strategy. The kind of perennial example I always harken back to are unions, workers' unions, not because workers' unions have always, have always been filled with perfect people who never get anything wrong politically, but because they have kinds of power and kinds of political leverage that other organizations don't. If unions don't like a thing that their employers are doing, they can withhold their labor, they can prop up politicians who will fight for their cause. There are all kinds of ways that you can convert demands into, or to put that another way, there's all kinds of ways that you can convert desires into demands. I think that's what I'm trying to say. If you are organized in that particular manner. But organization rather than the particular form of workers' union is the point. You can organize as debtors. That's what people in the debt collective are doing, for instance. You can organize as ratepayers to on behalf of all the people who pay bills to a particular utility. You can organize as tenants. There are plenty of tenants unions in the past and right now that are operating, but there has to be some form of leverage that emerges from your organizing in one of those forms, withholding rent, withholding bills paid to utilities, withholding debt payments, but some kind of form of organization that is built around a particular kind of power, and learning to exercise it is, I think, the way forward.
Right. So you kind of went to what's the importance of your book is, and as I was telling you, kind of we briefly touched base yesterday, and I said it is about elite capture, but you're doing a lot more than that. Like I felt like you were moving way beyond that, right? So in the beginning, you are kind of breaking down this idea of elite capture, its process, and how it's happened to identity politics. But of course, you, as someone who is also an organizer, you're, and a part of it was like, I was wondering if you see this book as like a roadmap, or, what you want this book to do. And partly what you just talked about, I think you're already kind of describing what you call the constructive politics, right? You're already talking about, as in your, if I'm paraphrasing you, to emphasize outcome over process. And so you're talking about the unions, the debt collective, like what they can do, or, I just appreciate your example about Flint, Michigan, because you're like, they can organize, or they can speak, what they need is clean water, right? So the importance of outcome. But, and I hope the time is still okay, but I really do want to get to that. But in order to get that, you don't just jump from critiquing elite capture to this idea of outcome. You dwell, and I thought was one of the most provocative, interesting parts of your book was your whole discussion of what you call deference politics. And, it's particularly interesting for me talking to you and to many of us probably on this seminar right now, because you are a professor at Georgetown, for instance, right? And I'm wondering if you could just kind of briefly explain to us what you meant by deference politics, and why, what the problem is. Like, why is it that you're speaking to me right now and you're speaking to us right now is not in itself maybe enough?
Yeah, by deference politics. So the first thing I should say is deference politics is a term I'm using as sort of a catch-all for the drift in how identity politics has been understood, right? So broadly speaking, a lot of people understand identity politics to mean a set of behaviors, a set of norms, and a set of priorities that are built around deference. So I would think of deference politics as a politics that emphasizes submitting to or following or adopting the political perspective of spokespeople from a marginalized group, or examples or role models from a marginalized group. So what I should do as a man is find, the examples of women, of non-binary folks, of trans men, etc., and let those be my guide to how I should think about gender, or as a person of a race somewhere higher up on the racial hierarchy, I should find someone who is Black or Indigenous and adopt their perspective on race, or something like that. Those kinds of sets of things, and not just in general, how should I mold my political perspective, but when I'm in the room with those people, maybe I should pass the mic to them. Maybe they should, get to have the speaking opportunities or the leadership opportunities, or so on and so forth. I'm not against any of those behaviors categorically. Sometimes some people should talk less. That's fine. But I am suspicious of that as a kind of political focus. And the Flint, Michigan example that you were bringing up in your question was just my way of trying to make it clear why I'm suspicious of that kind of focus. So for those who don't know, the Flint water crisis was one where the city of Flint, Michigan switched water sources. Partially because of that switch, the water was polluted. It was brown. It smelled funny. It had Legionnaire's disease. It had lead. And the state of Michigan just bald-facedly lied about this. And after lying about it, the residents of Flint did a bunch of things, including trying to get people to listen to them, of course. But it wasn't, it was important not just that other people heard their perspectives or, understood and really meditated on what it was like to be poisoned and really felt the trauma of being poisoned. It was also important that the water got clean, that the pipes were changed, etc. And so the things that the residents of Flint did all effectively pursued that outcome. They brought in scientists and led a citizen science campaign to get samples and prove that the state of Michigan was lying. They brought in lawyers to attack the state of Michigan using the court system and get financial damages and get pipes changed. And while the damage was done, that at the same time, they were, I think largely successful in self-defense in ways that a lot of other places haven't been. And I think what I learned from that is the importance of kind of keeping your eye on the ball politically. Because at the end of the day, just like Mayor Bowser here in DC is willing to paint Black Lives Matter on the street, but not necessarily defund the police, the symbolic victories that we can win by changing how we speak to each other in meetings, or which books we read from book lists, or who we cite or listen to as political figures, are a lot cheaper to the political system than the kind of core structural factors of how our political system works that we're trying to change. And if we're not careful, I think, a lot of people will exploit that. And I shouldn't even say will, because they are, right? This is present tense, it's past tense, and it's certainly future tense as well. But this is just how politics have been going, not just in the United States, but generally over the past few centuries, and it's just accelerated in recent decades.
Yeah, thank you for kind of expanding on that, because it was really striking to see that you're basically critical, right, of not fully, right? As you said, not categorically opposed, but the idea of, oh, let's listen to the most affected, let's pass the mic, let's center the people who are marginalized. And to me, I was like, oh yeah, like now people are always like, oh, I feel seen, I want to be seen, I want to be heard. But it's like, by whom, right? And I think you're right that that's not enough. Because I really enjoyed the way that you appreciated the way that you use this metaphor of the room and building, and how you said that basically passing the mic to the person in the room of privilege that's already been made doesn't actually change, right, the fundamental structures. But at the same time, of course, you yourself, right, as I said earlier, as a professor at Georgetown, you are the person to whom the mic is passed pretty frequently, I'm sure. And it's not that it's pointless, but I appreciate that you're saying it's not enough. And I will say it is important to have those voices to people speak, but yeah, I'm looking at, of course, like diversity, inclusion, equity efforts in universities, and this happens all the time, right? Where we get to speak, but then nothing really is transformed. So, of course, James, how are we doing with time? When does the Q&A have to begin?
We're good. We're good for another 10 minutes.
Okay, all right, so you already kind of alluded to, so you show us what elite capture is, how it works, identity politics, your kind of critique of deference politics is not being enough. And then you've already talked about your idea of this constructive politics through this example, especially Flint, right? That you need the results, you need new water, you need clean water. You can't just be the president on television talking about your struggles. But if I could just kind of pivot sort of in a different direction, still on this topic of constructive politics, I, as a historian of Brazil and someone who works in the Lusophone world, I was just so struck that you focus on Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of the oppressed, on conscientização, right? I don't know, what is it in English? Consciousness raising, conscientization.
Critical consciousness, yeah.
Critical consciousness.
Yeah.
And also its adoption in the context of liberation struggles in Portuguese Africa, especially Cape Verde, and in Guinea-Bissau. And I was just wondering, like, why did you want to choose, why your focus on this revolutionary pedagogy, and why did you, to think about constructive politics, why did you choose to speak about liberation struggles in Portuguese Africa?
That's a really good question. I think there are a couple of things that motivated me to talk about the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde. One is just a kind of historical or a kind of intellectual curiosity and preference, right? The central thinker that I studied while I was, finishing my dissertation and, kind of setting up where I wanted to be politically was Amilcar Cabral. And so that brought me to learning about colonialism in the Lusophone world, and the various struggles against the Portuguese Empire that were happening in these decades, the 60s and 70s, which is what I sort of pick up on when I'm talking about this in elite capture. But one of the reasons why I wanted to use this kind of example, other than shoehorning in Cabral, who I didn't actually end up talking much about because there was just so much other interesting stuff to follow up on, is because I wanted to do something that was in the opposite direction of where it seems to me that deference politics has sort of taken us in understanding identity politics. So as we've just been talking about, there's this way that people get caught up in representation and symbolism when they're talking about identity politics. Have I been heard? Have I been listened to? Is the person who's being celebrated somebody who I can relate to on this dimension or that dimension? And I use the war of liberation to remind people that, by liberation, and by political struggle, very recently, historically, people have meant something very literal and very, visceral by that. the PAIGC, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, was fighting a literal war. And to the extent that they thought about identity, it was as it related to a political struggle where the stakes were literally life and death. And I don't say that to, say that people right now have it fine and, everybody back then had it so much harder. I'm actually trying to say that the stakes are the same now. And because the stakes are the same, we should reject politics that asks us to trivialize those stakes. Like, that is the stakes. Life and death are the stakes of housing justice, of prison abolition, of police abolition. That's why people were in the streets and so angry. They were responding rightly to the fact that, these are murders, they're killing people. And we can't afford to make a politics that is about those kinds of stakes. We can't afford to make decisions about politics with those kinds of stakes over things that strike me as trivialities. And so that's why I picked, that combination of reasons is why I picked that particular historical juncture to think about. And of course, the thinkers who were involved in those struggles, the actors as well.
Yeah, and also, the whole education, obviously, I've had more experience studying with Brazil, with Central America, but how education, like, and especially this kind of revolutionary education, and I just appreciated how you, tied it into your work on an elite capture, and you're like, it's not the kind of education that will just teach people to, funnel resources to the elite, but in fact, this is a type of education that actually will break down the difference between elite and non-elites, right? So, I thought that was just a really beautiful way to kind of explain the concept of education, to kind of tying it back to your own work and your own vision. I know there's just a few minutes. Obviously I have a lot more questions. I won't ask all of them. I want to encourage people who are on this in this conversation to post your questions for Femi Taiwo in the Q&A. And meanwhile, I just, while you guys are posting your questions, I just maybe have a few more to ask, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. Maybe I could ask you, if I may, you, at the very end, I found the ending, your last pages, to be a little poignant, because, recently it's become much more common for many Black academics, intellectuals in their books to be much more kind of sharing about their personal story. And you sort of allude to it, but in a very subtle, understated way. And you, at the end, you do make reference to the traumas that you've experienced, but you cite James Baldwin, and you conclude by saying that trauma isn't, reductive. And this really resonated with me because I'm writing about the slave trade, and it's just terrifying. It's just terrible, right? And it's like it's only trauma. And then it's so easy to just reduce people to trauma. Like that's all there is. And yet you make this kind of beautiful statement that in fact, trauma is a way to connect us to others. And, I don't want you to put you on the spot and be like, tell us about that's not what I'm trying to do. But I'm wondering where that vision comes from, that trauma could become something that's connective.
I was determined in that last section to focus on, I'd given this argument about constructive politics, and I didn't choose that word constructive out of nowhere, right? Like, to the extent that I would being critical of things, and I'm being critical of a lot of things in this book, I wanted to be constructively critical. And I don't mean in the sense of just like being nice, but, what does this criticism teach us about what we should be doing? And so I wrote that last section on trauma in a way that was focused on, what I take to be the lesson about trauma that we get from Baldwin, that I've gotten from my own experiences. But I think it makes a little bit of sense if I at least say what I'm criticizing before I skip to the, what do we learn from this sort of thing? Maybe a little more generally. So throughout the book, I'm critical of deference politics. But I think one of the things behind it, and this is something that I also talk about in the book a bit, one of the things behind deference politics is a sort of genuine and weighty and serious need that a lot of the people who are sort of tastemakers in the cultural world have to work through their trauma. Right? A lot of people are thinking about trauma, and so are the audience for a lot of theory and a lot of film and a lot of TV, and that is on the whole a very good thing. But there is a way that trauma and bearing witness to trauma can participate in that part of deference politics I was criticizing earlier, right? At the end of the day, being heard about how bad it is to be poisoned was not the only thing that the people in Flint needed. They also needed clean water, right? And so I wanted to say something about not getting trapped in the bad uses of trauma. And I'm trying to be delicate about this for the sake of not of making an honest criticism rather than a dishonest criticism. So I don't want to portray people as having views that they don't actually have. But nevertheless, one thing that I think you do see in a lot of identity politics that is of this deferential kind is, I think, maybe the hope or just the assumption that the particular political positions people have come to after experiencing a kind of trauma are sort of the natural endpoint of that trauma. That a particular view on identity politics is, comes naturally from surviving this or that kind of harm or violence. And it just isn't true. Nothing like it is true. If anything, recent history points in a much different direction. Just to give one example I've been fixated on the past few years, the mass incarceration that we have in the United States was built by a coalition that included the victims' rights campaign, right? The victims' rights social movement. It just is not. It is not the case that trauma leads to progressivism, or at least is certainly not inevitably the case, or radicalism, or however it is that you define your politics. And I think the appeal to trauma as a sort of substitute for thinking through one's political commitments more directly is something that I think we have a lot of reasons to avoid doing. And I think one way of thinking about trauma that retains its importance, that takes it as seriously as we ought to, without committing that further error, is the idea that I was kind of taking my cues from Baldwin on, right? We can experience trauma as a way of understanding, what the stakes of being a person, a vulnerable, fragile, breakable person in this world are. That's not something that that endows us with a particular kind of political authority or a particular kind of insight. It's not something that separates us from other people. It's the thing that makes us like other people, and it's the thing in virtue of which we should have solidarity with other people. And my hope is that that is a way of thinking about trauma that both does justice to trauma itself, but I think just as importantly, does justice to what we're trying to achieve politically.
Thank you for stating it so beautifully. And of course, I had more questions about growing up Nigerian American in Cincinnati and all this stuff. And also, I did want to ask you, who is this book for? But you don't need to answer that right now, because I do want to make sure we get time for some audience questions. So I have a question from Luis Esparza, who says, thank you for the set of important and interconnected ideas. Doesn't using this concept of elite capture to describe the elite use of identity politics obscure the role and agency of certain parts of left movements in willingly aligning themselves with, and to some degree benefiting from, elite attacks and censorship against political conservatives? And you can also see the question in the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Louis. I'm not, let's see. Does it obscure the role and agency of certain parts of left movements in willingly aligning themselves with and benefiting from elite attacks against political conservatives? I don't think the term elite capture, if anything, the phrase elite capture makes it seem more intentional than I think the phenomenon actually is. I certainly think sometimes you have cabals of elites who plan to, deceive people or who plan to exploit or co-opt movements. But I think in general, you could explain why elite capture happens just by pointing to the fact that elites kind of organically have different concerns than other people, right? You probably just think less about, who regulates water if your water has always been clean. And if you have never had to literally, take up political struggle to make sure that your water was clean, right? So I think, if anything, the term elite capture makes, by using this sort of active verb, makes it seem a little more calculated than I think the phenomenon actually is. But I don't know. I think the second half of the question throws me for a little bit of a loop. So I don't know about the claim about censorship in particular, but I think it would make sense for the left to willingly align themselves with attacks against political conservatives, just because, that's the other side, right? Just as it would make sense for political conservatives to attack the left. So I don't think, even if there were a problem about obscuring agency, I don't think that that would be a reason to not use the term elite capture. But if I've misunderstood something about the question, I'm happy to take a second stab at it.
Okay, and then we have another question from an anonymous attendee. It's about music, actually. What do you think about Black musical forms that are rooted in protest, like reggae and hip hop, being co-opted by the elite and those living outside of racial capitalist oppression?
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's definitely the case that lots of forms of music are rooted in protest, or at least have strong connections to social movements that have done a lot of protesting and that were politically conscious. But I think, one thing that occurs to me to say is, what's the difference between co-optation and participation? Or between co-optation and regular use. One way you could run that difference is saying, well, co-optation is when you position yourself as somebody who can disproportionately benefit off of those forms of music, or particular forms of art, and the people who came up with those forms of art can't anymore. I don't know if that's quite true of either reggae or hip hop. I think lots of people from the Caribbean, lots of people from, say, the United States still are successful in those genres, but it's certainly the case that lots of people from different backgrounds are also successful in those genres. I guess a second thing I would say, and this is really more of a question, but obviously one I have some opinions on, is, how rooted in protest are these? DJ Kool Herc had political opinions. I don't know if I would describe, everything in the first generation of hip hop as being protest music. There was certainly protest music in there, but there's lots of other things people do with and through music, partying, relaxing, etc. It's, I think those are just as meaningful things to do with music as the kinds of protest songs that you also get through music. As somebody who thinks about music a lot, I think it's important to not try to colonize music to be just political expression, and that's something I think in general about art. So all of that kind of rambling and meandering sets up me basically saying, I don't know if I agree with the connection between those forms of music, or really any forms of music, and protest. I think those are among the many kinds of connections that those forms of music have, but there's lots of other things about them that are good. But if we want music to be more accessible to more people, I think a kind of constructive approach makes sense to me. Decades ago in the US, just to give an example that I'm familiar with, there was a lot more support for music education. And so the kind of class composition of people who were successful at music was a lot more diverse than things are now. And, that's something we would get back, by encouraging more music education rather than discouraging uses of music by people outside of particular groups.
So, James, I think
Thanks so much for that. Sorry, I awkwardly came out of the corner. We're just about time. Yuko, did you want to say something? Pardon me.
No, I just wanted to thank Femi. Can you, if this is even possible, can you say in one line who this book is for? Who did you envision? Who did you write this book for?
I wrote this book essentially for organizers and the sort of people that might become organizers. I think if you're going to be politically involved, I hope this is something you're thinking about.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to thank Femi Taiwo. Elite Capture is published by Haymarket Books, fall 2022. You can find it everywhere books are sold, I think. And I wanted to thank Femi Taiwo for this really, really engaging conversation. And I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity for me to read and this book and to converse with you today. And I'll turn it over to James.
Sure, thanks. I just want to echo that. Thank you so much, Professor Taiwo, and thank you, Professor Miki, on behalf of ASWAD. This was so generative, it was thick, it was dense, it was wonderful, and it was probing. So I think that was just fantastic. And it's a nice thing to do on a Monday. Now you've set a stage for the rest of the week, right? But just in brief, I want to say we have another book event. The next one that's taking place is on Monday, April 17th. It's at 3 p.m. Eastern. Maya Doig Acuna is interviewing Joanne Flores Villalobos on her new book, The Silver Women, How Black Women's Labor Made the Panama Canal. On behalf of ASWAD, with much appreciation. Thanks everybody for joining us, and take care. Thank you so much, guys.
So much, y'all. Appreciate it.